Well, you know I stay in the wilderness, stay in the wilderness, stay in the wilderness till I die. Oh Lord, stay in the wilderness, in the wilderness, stay in the wilderness till I die. Lord, you know I'm on in the wilderness, moan in the wilderness, moan in the wilderness till I die. Oh yes, oh Lord, wilderness. Oh yes, in the wilderness. Oh, in the wilderness till I die.
Well, then I stay
In the wilderness,
in the wilderness,
in
stay
the wilderness,
in the wilderness,
in the wilderness,
stay
in the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness
in the wilderness,
till I die.
in the wilderness,
Oh Lord,
in the wilderness,
stay
in the wilderness,
in the
in
wilderness,
the wilderness,
stay
in the
in
wilderness,
the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
stay
in the
in
wilderness,
the
in
wilderness
the
till I
wilderness,
die.
till I
Well, then I'm born
die. In the
in the
wilderness, in
wilderness,
the wilderness,
mold
in the
in
wilderness,
the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
mold
in the
in
wilderness,
the
in
wilderness
the
till I
wilderness,
die.
in the
Oh
wilderness,
Lord,
in the wilderness, in the
mold
wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
mold
in the
in the
wilderness, in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
mold
in the
in the
wilderness, in
wilderness
the
till I
wilderness,
die.
till I
Well, yes, I
die.
preached
In the wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
preached
Lord, in the wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
preached
in the wilderness,
in the
in
wilderness
the
till I
wilderness, in
die.
the
Oh
wilderness,
yeah,
in the
then I
wilderness,
preached
in the wilderness,
in the
in
wilderness,
the wilderness,
preached
in the
in the
wilderness, in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
preached
in the
in
wilderness,
the
in the
wilderness till I
wilderness,
die.
till I
Well, then I
die.
sing
In the wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
sing
Lord, in the wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
sing
in the
in
wilderness,
the
in
wilderness
the
till I
wilderness,
die.
in the
Oh
wilderness,
Lord, then I
Lord,
sing
in the wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
sing
in the
in
wilderness,
the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
sing
in the wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness till I
wilderness,
die.
till I
Yes, I'm gonna
die.
stay
In the wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
stay
Lord, in the
in
wilderness,
the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
stay
in the
in
wilderness,
the
in the
wilderness till I
wilderness,
die.
in the
Oh
wilderness,
Lord,
in the
then
wilderness,
I
Lord,
stay
in the
in
wilderness,
the
in
wilderness,
the wilderness,
stay
in the
in the
wilderness, in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
stay
in the wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness till I
wilderness,
die.
till I
Well, I'm gonna
die.
pray
In the wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
pray
Lord, in the wilderness,
in the
in the
wilderness,
wilderness,
pray
in the wilderness,
in the
in